Hi again, everybody. It's Dr. Lee Coleman welcoming you back. And I want to talk this time about something which is not active in my work and hasn't been for quite a while, but it certainly was in the late 70s, early 80s, as an example of how we put ourselves at risk every time we think that psychiatry or sometimes psychology is something that we should allow itself to be put into the middle of social controversies, kind of like their priesthood to tell us what's the right way to go. And so even though this area is not active in my work right now, and as far as I know, not in the general, who knows when the next example will come up of something similar. I'm talking about the use of mental health professionals to rationalize and justify kidnapping and false imprisonment of members of certain religious groups in the United States in the 70s and 80s. Sometimes it's been called by people who are critical of what they were doing as the anti-cult movement. But actually, I don't like to use that word cult, so let me quickly tell you what I mean by that, or why I don't like to use that term. There was a flurry of new religious groups that seemed to come up in that time period. You may remember, some of you will remember it, many of you will be way too young. But the Hare Krishnas, a group called the Children of God, the Church of Sun Myung Moon, sometimes called the Moonies, who was a Korean Christian group, the Scientologists, and a whole range of other groups were coming to attention, and many people were very critical. And I've never been an expert on the practices of any of those groups, but I got exposed to the movement that many people supported to try to do something about those groups, because they saw them as, many people saw them as very, very dangerous. And they would apply a term to them saying that they are cults. And I got, like so many of the areas that I worked in, I got, you might say, pulled into it, because I never had a reason to get into this controversy of these so-called, these groups which were felt to be so dangerous that critics would call cults, because I was never interested in being in any of them, certainly, and nothing that they were doing ever seemed to interact with my work or my life. But I got pulled into it because, once again, the work that I was doing, which in those days received quite a bit more attention in the media than it does now. At that time, prison issues that I was involved in and the role of psychiatry was receiving a lot of media attention. Work having to do with certain research, that proposals about the subject of violence and dangerousness. It's another area. I was doing a lot of media work there. In other words, I was studying these issues, writing, and then media would ask you to be a guest on a show and so forth. Well, in the same way, I began to get requests from people who were members of those groups. Sometimes it was Hare Krishna, Scientology, Moonies, or Sun Myung Moon, the group called the Love Israel Family, less well known up in the Seattle area, and some others. And the story was always the same. And so let me summarize it for you. And where we're going with this is to show you that once more, I was drawn into an area because mental health professionals were already in that area doing something which some people thought was very good and other people thought was very bad. And the people who thought what was happening was very bad were people who were in those groups and didn't like what was being done to them. And psychiatrists and psychologists were part of it. And so they knew about my criticism of the way we brought psychiatry and into these issues, and asked me to study and see what I thought and possibly participate in some way to alert people about the true state of mental health as I saw it. So basically, let's start with a book written by a guy named Ted Patrick. He wrote a book called Let Our Children Go. And that was not a book about children. It was a book about adults who were being physically removed from a group called the Children of God in Southern California. Now, to remove somebody physically is called kidnapping. And if you hold them somewhere, that's called false imprisonment. Those are two felonies. That's serious business. And why shouldn't it be serious? Well, Ted Patrick was the parent of a young boy, I think it was, but it doesn't matter. And he was very upset about what he saw of the activities of this group, the Children of God. And he decided that what he was going to do is just physically remove, I don't remember whether his own son, but he began to let people know that he was willing to physically take their son or daughter from out of one of these groups and do it, with careful planning. It wasn't he would just walk up there and get in a fight with somebody. He figured out a way to arrange a time where the person was not being in the company of a bunch of people where it would be difficult. In other words, he would arrange to snatch the person. And when I heard about this first, I got a hold of a copy of his book, and I could see from his descriptions that these were not children. These were young adults who were being taken. They were people of age. That means they were over 18 years old. And generally, they were in their early 20s. This was a time, the 60s had already happened. Flower children, alternative lifestyles. Youngsters were sometimes getting into drug taking, and certainly many things that might legitimately concern a parent. But they were adults. They were not minors. A parent would have no legal jurisdiction over somebody who's reached 18 years old. So it was obvious to me that this was criminal, what Ted Patrick was doing. But what I also began to learn about was that he wasn't having too much trouble continuing to do this, because he was actually notifying the police in many cases, telling them, I've been hired by the parents to help remove their son, let's say, from such and such a group, and it's going to be in this location, so we hope we'll get your cooperation. And in many cases, he was getting the cooperation of police. Sometimes they were actually show up and make sure that nobody interfered with the people who were going to interfere by taking this young adult out of a group. In other cases, the police would just agree not to show up, and therefore, even though they knew it was going to happen, would agree not to do anything. Now, why would the police agree to do that? Because Ted Patrick was very smart in his claim as to what he was doing. He said, these groups have brainwashed these young people. They say, these young people, these children, he called them, that they want to be in the group, but actually they don't really want to be in the group because they've been brainwashed. In other words, they don't really know what they want. Their free will has been stolen from them. So I'm actually rescuing them. This is Ted Patrick talking. I'm going to rescue them and then give them their free will back. In other words, I'm going to deprogram them. You deprogram somebody who's been programmed. So the only reason they want to be in the group is because the group knows how to brainwash or program people. I'm going to help them realize that the only reason they want to be in the group is because the manipulations of this cult. Well, eventually, Ted Patrick did start to get into trouble. And enough people began to raise questions. Like sometimes lawyers were actually being hired to represent the young adult. And some police had enough integrity to realize snatching somebody, from an adult, from a group and calling them children and calling them brainwash victims is just a lot of linguistic trickery. And so Ted Patrick began to get into trouble, and he was threatened with prosecution himself. And that's where psychiatry comes in. That's the reason we're talking about it now, is because as people who began to, either Ted Patrick doing it or people began to copy him, they call themselves deprogrammers. And a new profession began to develop as people who were in the business of snatching the son or daughter of who were adults at the behest of the parents, because the parents were paying them to do this. And they developed the same rationale as Ted Patrick. We are not taking anything away from them. We are giving them back their free will by taking them away by force and then putting them somewhere and holding them long enough until we can get them to realize that we're giving them back their free will. As the potential complications began to grow for such people, these deprogrammers, mental health professionals were recruited to defend with mental health language and mental health credentials these practices. So you had people like Dr. Margaret Singer, who was on the psychology department of the University of California right here in Berkeley, Dr. John Clark in a parallel kind of activity back in New England, and others, but that was a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and both basically began to write articles, give testimony. Typically would be a conservatorship hearing where, in order to get legal control over your adult child, just like if you had a parent who was elderly, you're, say, 50 years old, and you want to get control so that you can protect your mother or father who is 85 years old, you can argue that they're not able to take care of themselves, and there can be legitimate cases where that person does need somebody, and then there can be other cases where they don't need anybody, but somebody wants to get control anyway. Well, we won't get into that debate. It depends on the case. But parents began to sue or to ask a court to give them control of their adult son or daughter on the grounds that they needed a conservatorship, meaning they were not able to take care of their basic needs because they were mentally compromised by the activities of the cult, this new religious group. And you wouldn't stand too much chance of going to court and winning such a conservatorship hearing if you did not have mental health professionals as expert witnesses. So you had mental health professionals, not a huge number, thousands and thousands, but nonetheless enough that such conservatorships were granted in cases. People were then could be hospitalized in a mental hospital where they were given medication sometimes. I even was involved in some cases with this Love Israel family in Seattle where one individual was given lots and lots of shock treatment until eventually he was so disabled by the treatment that he would agree not to go back to the group that he had been in. So it could have devastating consequences. But this went on for quite a long time. I was involved in a number of cases where one of the groups was either the plaintiff suing the people who were initiating these kidnappings, so-called deprogrammings, and in other cases where they're the ones being sued by the parents, let's say, of somebody who had a son or daughter that was kidnapped. So for a while, it was allowing mental health professionals to once again get into the legal arena, influence courts about whether somebody is free or not, to join a group. And it's really like these mental defenses that I've talked about. A court would have no trouble evaluating whether somebody was in a group by force, as the parents and the kidnappers were claiming. What I found was that every time there was a case where mental health professionals were the experts claiming that brainwashing was going on and they really didn't even know what they wanted, it's because there wasn't any evidence that they were being held against their will, or they wouldn't have needed to call in the mental health professionals. They only needed the mental health professionals to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. That is, because there was no evidence, they needed to create phony evidence by the use of mental health testimony. And once again, my testimony was to say, I'm not an expert on the practices of these groups. If they are committing fraud, let them come to court and demonstrate it by evidence of fraud. We don't need mental health professionals for that. If they are holding people by force, that's a matter of police investigation. But theories of brainwashing are not something that is reliable. As a matter of fact, when brainwashing, as we've come to think of it in the original sense, was actually studied in a responsible way at the time of the Korean War, what they found was that when you had force to put people in a situation where you could make their life very uncomfortable, and only less uncomfortable if they would say or do things that you wanted them to do, something we usually call torture, you could do that. But the minute you didn't have force, you didn't have any power to influence the way they thought. So it was just the opposite of these cases. The people who were holding people by force were not the religious groups. They never had any evidence that the Hare Krishnas, the Munis, the Scientologists, and any of the others kept people against their will. But the force was being applied by the people who were taking them out by force. That's the reason I wrote an article about it, and it's on my CV, so you can see it when you look at my website. And it's called, now what is it called? I just slipped my mind.
Check it out.
Yeah.
And then just pick up as it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I got it. So this article is called New Religions and Deprogramming, Who's Brainwashing Whom? And what I showed in that article was, if you study what brainwashing was, it was the attempt by the North Koreans and the Chinese communists in the Korean War, 1950 to 53, to apply enough pressure to people in conditions of confinement, imprisonment, that would try to retrain them or change their political views. American prisoners by North Koreans or Chinese. And what they found is some people would say or do things that was to the liking of the people who held them in captivity, but the minute they got free, they went right back to their original political points of view. So force is what can control people. Religious ideology was not being combined with force by these religious groups that were under attack. I welcome you to try to get my article through the website, just contact us and we'll make sure that you can get it. I wrote a pamphlet called Psychiatry, the Faith Breaker. You can read about that on the website, meaning that psychiatry was being used as a tool, as a weapon by people who simply didn't like the groups. If they had a legitimate gripe against a group, I certainly don't know. I'm not, as I said, a student of the groups. I'm not defending them. I'm not a member of any of them. Don't have any plans to do so. Psychiatry has no business getting in the middle of such conflicts. And every time we do it, we set the stage for them to do it again some other time. There's a lot of recommendations now with all the terrible things going on in our society with violence and weapons to start evaluating this and that and the other. Let's have psychiatrists evaluate the president. Let's have psychiatrists lock people up and make sure they're not going to end up becoming mass shooters. Every time we do it, we'll come to the day when we regret it. And we will stop doing it when we have the right understanding of what psychiatry and psychology and mental health professions are all about. I hope that I'm helping you to do that, to get a better understanding. Thanks very much for coming. See you next time.